We want to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Her name is Rebecca Heisman. She lives in the city of Running Waters, also known as Walla Walla, Washington. She describes herself as a bird-obsessed freelance writer. Rebecca has worked with organizations including the Audubon Society, the American Bird Conservancy, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, the Wilson Ornithological Society, and the American Ornithological Society. From 2015 to 2020, she worked for the American Ornithological Society, the world's largest professional organization for bird scientists. She has contributed to publications including Audubon Magazine, Sierra Magazine, Hakai Magazine, Biographic, Living Bird, and Bird Conservation. Rebecca says of herself, "I love birds and I love writing. Flight Paths tells the epic scientific story of how we know what we know about bird migration." So with that, I would like to turn tonight's meeting over to our guest presenter, Rebecca, and go ahead, Elaine, and let's get that rolling.
All right, thank you. Give me 1 second to get started with my PowerPoint here.
That's
there we go.
perfect.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'm so happy to be here tonight. I was excited to be invited. I am here tonight because as was just said in the introduction, I am the author of a book on how we know what we know about bird migration. I have spent several years of my life now immersed in this topic. I have read more scientific papers than I could possibly count. I've talked to dozens of scientists. I've joined some of them in the field, and I feel really privileged that my job is to tell some of these amazing stories. And it's a really fun job to have because there are so many good stories to tell about bird migration. These are just a few of the amazing migrators whose stories appear in my book. On the left, we have the bar-tailed godwit, which famously makes a nonstop flight from Alaska to New Zealand across the Pacific Ocean in the fall without touching down anywhere in between, which is mind-blowing. In the middle is the bar-headed goose, which makes the highest altitude migration in the world. They cross over the tops of the Himalayan mountains. And then on the upper right, we have the blackpoll warbler. These guys in fall, to get from New England down to their wintering grounds in South America, regularly make a 3-day nonstop flight over the sort of western end of the Atlantic Ocean, which sounds less impressive than what the godwit does until you remember that a godwit is about the size of a football and a blackpoll warbler weighs about the same as a ballpoint pen. So it's pretty amazing. But for me, what fascinates me just as much as what migrating birds do and how they do it is how we figured all of this out. That's what my book is really about, and that's what I'm here to talk about tonight. Before I dive too far into that, I want to give just some really brief background about me and how my book came to be. So Dave mentioned in his introduction, before COVID, I worked for the American Ornithological Society, which is the big professional organization in the US for scientists who study birds. So they give out research grants, they put on an annual scientific conference, and they publish 2 scientific journals, which are what you see here. This is where scientists publish the findings of their new research. And I was their communications person, 1-person communications department. And a big part of my job there was promoting the research that was being published in these journals and publicizing it. So I was reading a lot of scientific papers. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the structure of a scientific paper, but they all follow the same basic formats. There's the introduction, where the researchers, the scientists, talk about what they were studying, what question they were trying to answer, and why. There's the methods, where they explain in detail how they did it, step by step. And then there's the results and discussion, where they explain what they found and why it matters. And I was reading all these papers, and I kept getting sucked in to the section that I think a lot of people sort of skim over to get to the good stuff, which is the methods. I didn't know, or if I had learned in an undergraduate ornithology class, I had forgotten, that you can study bird migration using weather radar. You can study it by putting out microphones to record the flight calls of birds passing overhead at night. You can study it by analyzing rare hydrogen isotopes in feathers. That one still blows my mind. And I started to wonder who figured out that that some of these things were even possible, and how did they figure out, and what's the science behind how this works? So around the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, I left that job and I wrote a book proposal. And so that's the book that came out this spring. This is actually the table of contents from the book. Basically, in the book, what I do is I just go chapter by chapter through each of the major methods that have been used to study bird migration in the last century plus. So starting with bird banding and going all the way up through things like miniaturized satellite transmitters and high volume genetic sequencing. I cover a lot of ground in it. But when I thought about how to adapt this into a 40-minute, give or take, book talk, I decided that the most fun thing to do, rather than trying to pack in everything, would just be to zoom in on 3 of my favorite stories from the book. So that's what I'm going to do this evening, is share the stories of 3 of my favorite migration innovators that I learned about while doing this research. And my hope is that you will come away with a new appreciation for all the hard work and creativity that went into uncovering every gee whiz fact that you hear about bird migration. So the first tactic I'm going to talk about for figuring out what migratory birds are doing is one that I hadn't even heard of before I started doing the research for this book, and that is moon watching. Now, most birds migrate at night, most songbirds anyway, which means you can't just look up and see them because it's dark. You need to get a little creative. Today, we have all sorts of tools like radar and satellite telemetry to help us spy on night migrating birds. But before any of that technology was developed, this guy, whose name was George Lowry, came up with a really clever way to do it using just a telescope. George Lowry was born in Louisiana in 1913. He was fascinated by birds from a very young age. In 1936, he finished his master's degree from the University of Louisiana at Baton Rouge, and he stayed on there for the rest of his career as an instructor and an ornithologist, and he helped found LSU's Museum of Zoology. Now, being an avid birder and growing up along the coast of Louisiana, George Lowry would have been very familiar with the phenomenon of migratory fallout. So I'm sure some of you have heard of this. This is when, depending on the weather conditions, birds that are migrating north in the spring and crossing the Gulf of Mexico sometimes just sort of fall out of the sky en masse at the first bit of land that they see. And so you can get these incredible concentrations of migrants right along the coast. And although there wasn't really any way to prove it at the time, a lot of ornithologists in the early 20th century, George Lowry included, thought it was likely that migrating birds were crossing over the open water of the Gulf of Mexico on a regular basis, that this migration over the Gulf was a normal thing. But then in the 1940s, a biologist by the name of George Williams, our second George for this story, I'm sorry, it seems to be a popular name for mid-century ornithologists. George Williams came along and said, hang on, this doesn't make any sense. Why would all of these birds voluntarily fly over 500 miles of open water when Mexico is right there? Basically, he said, they got to be going through Mexico. I know no one really sees very many of these migrants there, but we must just not be looking hard enough because it's the only thing that makes sense. Now, George Lowry, again, being very familiar with the whole with migratory fallout, having seen the evidence of trans-Gulf migration with his own eyes, was very annoyed by this. He was immediately determined to prove George Williams wrong, and he started casting about for a way that he might do that. And he remembered some quirky ornithology papers from the very beginning of the 20th century, where folks had reported looking at the full moon through a telescope during bird migration and being able to see the silhouettes of birds passing in front of the moon. Lowry thought, maybe there's something there. Maybe I could do something with that. Luckily for him, there was an astronomer also working at LSU at the time who was really into birds. So Lowry and this astronomer put their heads together and they came up with a set of equations that would let Lowry take raw data on the number and direction of birds passing across the moon in a given amount of time and turn that into an estimate of the total number of birds crossing an imaginary 1-mile line on the Earth's surface every hour, which I will be the first to admit sounds very abstract. But basically what this boiled down to is Lowry now had a way to directly compare how much migration was going on at one place in time with how much migration was going on at another place in time. There'd never really been a good way to do that before. And Lowry dubbed this the migration traffic rate. So April 1945, George Lowry packs up a telescope, gets on a boat, headed across the Gulf of Mexico for a port on the Yucatan Peninsula. The first night, he's all excited. He goes out on deck. He sets up his telescope, points it at the moon, looks in the eyepiece, only to realize that the moon is continually bobbing up and down, in and out of sight because of the motion of the waves. There was no way he was going to be able to get a good count of birds like this. But this was not a man who gave up easily. He was undeterred, and he waited a couple days until the boat docked in the Yucatan, where the water was calmer, and he tried again. He pointed his telescope at the moon rising over the Gulf, and in 45 minutes he tallied 12 birds, which might not sound like a lot, but when he did the math, it worked out to more than 3,700 birds passing over a 1-mile line extending out into the Gulf every hour. So Lowry had just collected the first hard numerical evidence that trans-Gulf migration was real. That's a lot of birds. Now, he knew he was onto something with this moon watching thing, so he was just getting started. He had all sorts of plans for this. His next idea was to scale it up and recruit volunteers from across North America to collect this type of data. Today, we would call this citizen science or community science, and there's a whole chapter in my book just about that. In the 1940s and 50s, those terms hadn't been coined yet. Lowry just knew that he had hit on a method that had the potential to reveal migration patterns at the scale of the entire continent for the first time. But he wasn't going to be able to do it alone. Luckily for him, right about this time, a young, enthusiastic grad student arrived on the scene at the LSU Museum of Zoology, and his name was Bob Newman. So that's George Lowry again on the left and Bob Newman on the right. Again, Bob Newman was a young man at the time that I'm talking about, but it turns out that at least in the pre-smartphone era, people did not get a lot of photos taken of themselves until later in their career when they became more famous. So I was unable to find a photo of Bob Newman as a young man. You'll have to use your imagination. Now, both of these men passed away decades ago. I was not able to interview either of them when working on my book, but I did get to interview an ornithologist now in his 80s who worked with both of them when he was a grad student. And he was kind enough to share some of his memories of them with me. It sounds like in a lot of ways, these two men could not have been more different. Lowry was an old school gentleman naturalist who wore a suit and tie even for field work and organized expeditions into the jungle to gather more specimens for his museum. And he was a workaholic who would go home to eat dinner with his wife, only to reappear at the office to get some more work done in the evening. Newman was a jokester. He had a reputation for liking a good prank, and he also approached problems a lot more like a modern scientist. He taught himself statistics before that was a common skill for zoologists. You did not need to know stats to be a zoologist in the 50s. And he also made it a personal mission to keep up with the latest bird migration research being published all over the world. But in spite of their differences, these two men forged a working partnership that would last all the way until Lowry's death in the 1970s. And together they came up with a plan to collect a snapshot of migration activity across the entire continent during a single week in October. No one had ever tried anything like this before. And keep in mind, this was before the internet, and it was pretty much before computers. There would have been a few primitive computers in the US at the time, but these two guys definitely did not have access to them. So the way they got the ball rolling on this was they spent literally as much as 12 hours a day handwriting personal letters to hundreds of potential volunteers targeting, local Audubon chapters and bird watching clubs around the country, explaining the goals of the project and what would be required of data collectors and the special contribution that each participant would be making to science. And they eventually were able to recruit 2,500 volunteers in 325 locations from Canada all the way down to Panama. They really wanted to do this right and make sure that the data that they collected was as high quality as possible. So they even took the step of printing up a how-to pamphlet for their volunteers, complete with some tips on how to stay comfortable during long stints of moon watching. This is an actual figure from Lowry and Newman's moon watching how-to pamphlet. Knowing that Bob Newman had a reputation for his sense of humor, I can't quite decide if this figure was meant to be funny or if it was just the 50s. But regardless, in fall 1952, telescopes swung into action across North America. Pretty soon, observations were flooding in. Paper data sheets, mailed from every part of the country, were stacking up higher and higher and higher on Lowry and Newman's desks. And they realized that they had a problem that they probably should have thought more about ahead of time, which was how to analyze all that data. Now, again, no computers, no calculators. This was before most zoologists even had any training in statistics. They now needed to calculate the average direction and volume of bird migration from hundreds of locations. They wanted to look for patterns like relationships between bird migration and the weather. So they had to look up data on temperature and wind and the movement of cold fronts for each of those locations in printed books of weather records. They had to depict all of this on maps, which they would have to draw by hand. It took them 14 years. Finally, in 1966, their magnum opus appeared in the ornithological journal, the Auk, which coincidentally is one of the same journals I would be working for about 50 years later. They titled it A Continent-Wide View of Bird Migration on 4 Nights in October. And it included page after page of these painstakingly crafted maps where they used red, white, and black arrows to indicate the direction and the volume of migration at locations across the continent on the nights of October 1st through 4th, 1952. And you could see at a glance that in the Midwest and East, there were these massive migratory flights that spanned multiple states with reports from a lot of different locations that were really consistent on how many birds were passing over and the precise direction that they were heading. They could see that favorable winds and the movement of cold fronts both clearly affected migration patterns across the continent, with the heaviest migration occurring in front of advancing cold fronts. Any of you who like to check the weather forecast during migration to try and guess when the next big wave is going to pass through your area are probably already familiar with this idea of migrants riding advancing weather fronts. But to see this at such a large scale would have been totally new at the time that this was published. There was no, satellite imagery of the Earth or anything like that at this point. So I feel like it's almost hard to imagine how groundbreaking this must have been. This paper was a blockbuster. It was 40 pages long. It influenced studies of migration for years to come. It was also the last moon watching paper that Lowry and Newman would ever publish, because all of that hard work was about to be made almost completely obsolete by the rise of a new technology, actually developed by one of their students, which was radar. So I'm sure some of you have seen an image like this before. This was taken from the nationwide weather radar system, the same one that you see images from on the Weather Channel with the green and orange blobs to show you where rainstorms are. And you can actually see some rain on this map over on the East Coast. But I'm sure at least some of you watching tonight know what all of those round blobs down the middle of the continent are. Those are, of course, birds. So they generally filter migrating birds and any other distractions out of the radar images that they use for TV weather reports. But birds actually show up really well on radar. And the reason you see these round blobs is just because each of those is the field of view of one individual radar station. And so as the birds lift off for their night of migration, they completely saturate the field of view of each one. Now, when people first started using radar in a big way, it hadn't really occurred to anyone yet that they might pick up birds. They weren't looking, the first people to use radar weren't looking for birds, and they weren't looking for rainstorms either. They were looking for Nazi planes in World War II. So radar stands for radio direction and ranging. I'm going to get technical just for a really quick moment here. Basically, how radar works is a special transmitter beams out radio waves. As those waves bounce off objects in their path, some of that energy is reflected back to the radar equipment, and how much energy comes back and the angle that it comes in at tell you something about the size and direction of any objects that are out there. It's like sonar or echolocation, but with radio waves instead of sound. Now, scientists had worked out the basic principles of this by the 1930s, and by the time World War II officially broke out, they had built radar stations up and down the British coast, that Great Britain had done this, to detect incoming planes coming from the mainland. But pretty much as soon as these new radar stations were operational, they started picking up some weird signals, which, unlike planes that plodded along at consistent speeds and trajectories, they sort of appeared and disappeared and changed direction at random. No one could figure out quite what they were looking at. And supposedly, at one point, a red alert was sounded and British fighter planes were urgently ordered into the air to intercept strange signals heading across the English Channel, only to get up into the sky and find nothing there. And the exasperated radar operators started calling these mystery signals angels. While all this was going on, this guy, whose name was David Lack, had been teaching science at a secondary school in Devonshire in southwestern England. And he didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the father of radar ornithology. Now, again, I should mention David Lack was a young man in the time period that I'm talking about, but the people only get pictures of them taken later when their famous thing applies here too. Lack had always been interested in birds. He studied ornithology at Cambridge before becoming a teacher. And in 1938, he took a year off from his teaching job to travel to the Galapagos Islands to study Darwin's famous finches. He got back to the UK just as war was breaking out, and he later wrote a brief memoir about the early years of his career, so I'm going to read in his own words what happened next when he arrived back in England on the brink of war. I had become a pacifist at the age of 17. He had signed a pledge to an anti-war organization. And in the autumn of 1940, I decided that I ought to leave my job at the school to work with a pacifist unit. I spent a trial night in the East End of London during heavy raids, but was so put off by the pacifists' earnest attitudes and so excited by the flashes and bangs that I was immediately converted from pacifism. A month later, the Central Register for Scientific Workers sent me to interview for an unspecified job. As a biologist, you will of course have learned a lot of physics, the interviewer said. I'm afraid not, I answered. Well, I expect your maths is of a high standard. I'm afraid not. Then very doubtfully, I fear this job will often entail going out in the wet and cold in the dark. Would you mind that? Not at all. So I was taken on and 10 days later set off from London with 19 other biologists on a mystery coach tour. Excuse me. You see where this was going? They put him to work on radar because apparently pretty much any science degree was good enough to get you a job working on radar at this point in the war effort. Lack was first posted to the Orkneys, which are a wet, windy, remote group of islands off the north end of Scotland. I gather Lack was just about the only person happy to be sent there because he got to spend all of his off hours looking for birds like puffins and skuas. The birding was really good in the Orkneys. But shortly after that, he was reintroduced to an old acquaintance of his from Cambridge named George Varley, our third and final George of the evening. Varley was an old classmate of Lack's from Cambridge. He was an entomologist by training, so he was a bug guy, but he also had now ended up working on radar systems. And it was Varley who introduced Lack to the mystery of the angels plaguing the radar operators. Now, Lack was an ornithologist by training. He knew the behavior of birds in flight. He heard the description of these so-called radar angels and pretty much immediately was like, guys, it's birds. But very few people believed him at first, and so Lack and Varley set about trying to prove that the radar angels were actually birds, and they got pretty creative about it. At one point, they actually convinced an officer to tie a dead gull to a balloon and send it aloft into the path of a radar detector just to demonstrate that it was at least possible for a bird body to produce a radar signal. Finally, in September 1941, Varley managed to use a powerful telescope to confirm that the source of his signal being tracked offshore in real time was in fact a flock of gannets. As the war continued, Lack and Varley continued to collect more radar observations that they believed represented birds. The technology was advancing, and so they were getting more and more of these representing smaller and smaller birds all the time. And they were collecting evidence that the behavior of the radar angels was consistent with the behavior of birds in flight. There were still a few skeptics. So I have one more brief quote from David Lack because I can't get enough of his sense of humor. At one meeting, he wrote, after the physicists had again gravely explained that clouds of ions must be responsible, Varley with equal gravity accepted their view, providing that the ions were wrapped in feathers. Finally, in 1945, as the end of the war neared, they got permission to publish their previously top secret findings in the journal Nature. Today, Lack, who died in 1973, is better remembered for a book he wrote about Darwin's finches, but this publication, again, essentially kicked off the entire subdiscipline that's now known as radar ornithology. Radar ornithology might have died an early death if not for the fact that it turns out that storms show up on radar just as well as airplanes and birds do. And after the war, meteorologists started developing radar technology as a way to provide early warnings about hurricanes and major storms. Large flocks of birds showed up just as well on weather radar as they do on military radar. So this was great news for ornithologists. Over time, advances in weather radar technology, like the introduction of Doppler radar, have made it possible to gather better and better information about migrating birds this way. And this continues to be a major source of data on large-scale bird migration patterns. So just really briefly, this is one modern study that I think really shows the power of this type of data. In 2018, a pair of scientists downloaded radar scans covering every evening for more than 20 years, 150,000 individual radar scans, and analyzed them to see how weather factors like temperature and wind and air pressure predicted the appearance of big migration movements on radar. Their math explained almost 80% of the variation in migration intensity from one night to the next, and they found that using this method, they could even predict big migratory movements several days in advance. If you're paying attention, you might notice that this is basically the same thing that Lowry and Newman were trying to do with moon watching data. It's just that now we have much better data and we have computers to analyze it with. So this right here, this radar study right here is the basis for something that some of you might be familiar with, which is Birdcast. This really nifty tool that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology runs during migration to predict when and where big migratory flights are going to happen. And it is all thanks to a witty science teacher from Devonshire who realized what must really be going on with those mysterious angels annoying the radar operators guarding England from the Nazis. But of course, radar isn't the only way to put radio waves to work tracking birds. And that brings me to my third and final and favorite migration innovator of the evening. There we go. So this guy's name is Bill Cochran. I actually do have a photo of a young Bill Cochran on the left there, and then Bill later in his career on the right. In the mid-1950s, Bill Cochran was a young Navy veteran living in Illinois and working on an electrical engineering degree part-time while also working for a brand new television station based in Champaign, Illinois. One morning, he went out to check on his employer's transmitter tower on the outskirts of town, and there he found an ornithologist from the University of Illinois picking up dead birds off the ground. Bill Cochran was intrigued by this and started peppering the guy with questions about what he was doing there and what he was doing with those birds. It turned out that the man's name was Richard Graber, and he was studying tower kills, which is the phenomenon where flocks of birds fly into communications towers and are killed by the impact. Cochran was very intrigued, and soon he was spending his spare time tinkering together gadgets to help Graber in his work. Excuse me, my throat starts to dry out when I talk for this long. So Bill Cochran appears in more chapters of my book than any other one researcher. The first project he and Graeber worked on together was they were actually the first guys to figure out a way to record the nocturnal flight calls of birds flying overhead. So these are the unique calls that night migrating birds make in flight that they don't make at other times. And one of my favorite little stories from the whole book is Bill Cochran, the engineering student, figuring out how to rig up a tape recorder with bicycle axles to hold these 6,000 feet of tape that they would need to record an entire night. But the chapter where Bill Cochran looms largest in my book is the one on radio telemetry. So telemetry just means transmitting data from one place to another in real time. And there were two technological advances right around this time that really helped kick off the field of radio telemetry. First was the invention of the transistor in 1947. I am going to hazard a guess that I am the first person to present to WAS and include a photo of the first transistor in my PowerPoint. Briefly, before this, radios relied on bulky, breakable vacuum tubes to amplify the signals that they sent out. Transistors provided a lightweight, efficient, durable way of doing the same thing, and they made it possible to adapt radios for all sorts of tasks that they wouldn't have been suited for before, including transmitting all kinds of data from one place to another. Just about the first group to start experimenting this was the US Navy. They started using radio signals to transmit real-time data on a jet pilot's vital signs to a doctor monitoring them from the ground, and to study the effectiveness of cold water suits for sailors by transmitting temperature data. But it did not take long at all for wildlife researchers to begin borrowing these ideas. In 1957, scientists in Antarctica used the system from the cold water suit tests to monitor the temperature of a penguin egg during incubation. That's what's going on here. Those are penguins in the lower right. That same year, a group of researchers in Maryland borrowed some ideas from the jet pilot project and surgically implanted transmitters in woodchucks to follow their movements around a small nature preserve. Pretty soon, big engineering firms like Honeywell were getting involved, trying to design radio tracking systems that they could sell to wildlife biologists to use to track animals' movements. But they were trying things like strapping a metal box containing a radio transmitter onto the back of a grouse and releasing it into the bushes. Turns out that a grouse with a metal box strapped to its back does not last very long in the field. So before wildlife telemetry could really take off, someone was going to have to think outside the box. Ha ha ha, sorry, I had to. And that someone turned out to be Bill Cochran. Now, I did say two major technological advances that helped make all this possible. The second one was the launch of Sputnik in 1957. Sputnik, of course, was the first artificial satellite launched by the Soviets. Basically, all this thing did was circle the Earth and beep, but you could pick up that beep from anywhere on Earth if you had the right kind of radio equipment. And this touched off a whole new wave of interest in both radio and satellites. And by 1960, Bill Cochran, who still had not actually finished his degree, but was apparently something of a transistor savant, had picked up more part-time work helping a University of Illinois astronomer build radio beacons for some of the first US satellites. Actually, some of the first US spy satellites, although they didn't know that's what they were working on. Cochran was also still doing work with Graeber and his colleagues at the Illinois Natural History Survey. And it did not take long before someone there suggested combining Cochran's two part-time gigs. Hey, Bill, what do you think would happen if we tried putting one of those fancy radio transmitters on a duck? I don't know, let's try it. So they sent a duck over from the field station on the Illinois River. They strapped the transmitter onto the bird using a metal band over its chest. And although they hadn't really planned this, it turned out that the bird's breathing distorted this band in a way that affected the radio signal. And when they released the duck, they could track its respiratory rate as it flew, accidentally collecting the first data on the vital signs of a bird in flight. And the moment that duck with the radio transmitter took flight, that determined the course of the rest of Bill Cochran's career. He was fascinated by this immediately and spent the following decades and decades really building radio transmitters to be worn by animals. So we're not talking about just birds here. If you're familiar with, radio collars for deer and wolves and things like that, Cochran was really the guy who figured out how to make all of that practical. Building a radio transmitter to be worn by an animal, especially a smaller animal, requires making trade-offs among a long list of factors. A longer antenna will give you a stronger signal, and a bigger battery will give you a longer lasting tag, but they both add weight. Cochrane, who wouldn't officially finish that engineering degree for several more years, turned out to be really good at getting this balance just right. He favored designs that were as small and simple and compact as possible, and instead of putting all the components in a metal box, he figured out how to just dip the whole assembly of parts into plastic resin to seal everything together and waterproof it. He started out doing some projects for biologists working on rabbits and other small mammals, but it wasn't long before he was building transmitters small enough that they could safely be worn by large songbirds, which worked out great because his old friend and mentor, ornithologist Richard Graeber, particularly loved to study thrushes. And so in 1965, Richard Graeber found a pilot who was willing to try following a migrating radio-tagged thrush at night in a small plane, because these transmitters only had a range of a few miles. So if you wanted to use them to follow the movements of a migrating bird, you literally had to follow the bird to stay within range. In May 1965, they captured a gray-cheeked thrush outside Urbana, Illinois, trimmed the feathers from a small patch on its back, and it stuck on a transmitter using eyelash glue, the stuff that you use to attach false eyelashes, which, side note, is still really popular for this because it doesn't irritate the skin and it wears off on its own after a while. That night, Graeber and the pilot followed this bird for 400 miles before turning back, 200 of which were over the open water of Lake Michigan. Graeber was so awed by this experience, sitting in the cockpit, flying through the dark, unable to see the bird, of course, but listening to the beep, beep, beep of its transmitter and thinking about the amazing thing that this bird was doing, that he later compared this experience to the awe that he felt watching the television coverage of the Apollo moon missions. And Bill Cochrane was just getting started. 1973, Cochrane and a student named Charles Welling tag another thrush passing through Illinois in the spring, and this time they spend a full week following this bird almost 1,000 miles all the way across the Canadian border and up into Manitoba in a station wagon with a hole cut in the top for their radio receiver, which you can see here. At one point, Welling, the student who came along to help drive, apparently spent a night in jail when a suspicious police officer pulled them over in rural Minnesota, because who wouldn't be suspicious of this thing driving through their small town at night in rural Minnesota? Cochrane did not want to stop for very long for fear that he would lose the bird's signal. So from what I gather, he basically kicked Welling out of the car to sort things out as best he could, kept on driving, waited until the bird set down around dawn, because again, these are night migrating birds, doubled back and bailed the kid out and kept going. They gathered data on the bird's altitude, its airspeed and ground speed, the distance it covered each night, and its heading, and the specific heading that it set off on each night. And because they were able to stick with the bird over such a long distance, Cochrane and Welling were able to track how the precise direction that the bird set out in each night changed as its position changed relative to magnetic north. And the gradual changes they saw in its heading provided some of the first real-world evidence that migrating songbirds use some sort of internal magnetic compass as one of their tools for navigation. The only reason they stopped after they crossed into Manitoba was actually that the car's engine gave out. They were pouring ditch water into whatever part of a car engine you pour water into, trying to keep it going, and finally it was no good and they had to stop. Now Cochrane, again, Bill Cochrane was an engineer. He was not a biologist. He never really got the hang of the politics of academia or of the peer review system for scientific publishing. He always remained a bit of an outsider, and I gather that he may not have been personally the easiest person to get along with either. Kind of a cantankerous dude. And by the late 90s, he had left the Illinois Natural History Survey on what I gather were less than good terms. But he kept building radio systems for ornithologists in his garage right into the beginning of this century. And while researching the book, I had the great good fortune to speak to Bill multiple times and even to visit him at his home in Illinois, where most of his backyard was taken up with an enormous radio receiver tower. And yes, this station wagon was still in the driveway. He was a hilarious character. I will always remember he loved to screen his calls by pretending to be a janitor at an animal shelter when he answered his phone. I would call him at a prearranged time for a phone interview, and he'd pick up and go, "Animal shelter, sorry, we're closed." And I'd be sitting there sort of confused going, "Bill, is that you?" Anyway, he was just a hoot. Sadly, he passed away last year at the age of 90, and I really believe that he is an unsung hero of 20th century science, and I'm happy that my book is hopefully going to make more people aware of all the things that he accomplished. So I'm reaching the final section of my talk here. In my last couple minutes, I'm going to talk just a little bit about migratory connectivity and why all of this matters. When I was working on this talk and deciding what stories from the book to adapt into a talk, I intentionally chose some of the more historical stories, largely because I have given this talk for audiences of scientists, and I didn't want to find myself talking about someone who was sitting in the audience. That would be awkward. But if you get to read the book, not only will you get to read about a lot of ornithologists who are not dead white guys, but you will also get to read about the latest advances like miniaturized tracking devices and artificial intelligence tools for analyzing big data sets, high volume genetic sequencing, all that stuff. Thanks to all these recent high-tech advances, we now have a clearer and more detailed picture of bird migration than we ever have before. That data can help us target conservation efforts more effectively. And boy, that is a good thing because migratory birds are in trouble. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this paper. This came out a few years ago and it got a lot of publicity. It was dubbed the 3 billion birds paper because billion with a B, because as you can see, it was a large group of scientists who worked on this. They drew from a lot of different sources of data to come up with an estimate that there are about 2.9 billion fewer breeding birds in North America now than there were in 1970, which is just staggering. Researchers and wildlife managers have been scrambling to figure out how to stop the bleeding. And so when it came time to write a conclusion for my book and kind of tie a bow on the whole thing, I wanted to tackle the question of whether some of these new tracking technologies might be part of the answer and whether there's any reason to feel hopeful about the future. So part of how I did that was I got in touch with a couple of the leading experts in migratory bird conservation today and asked them what they thought. I talked to Pete Mara, who was one of the senior authors on this paper and co-founder of the Road to Recovery initiative that grew out of it. I also talked to Jill Deppy, who's the director of the Audubon Society's Migratory Bird Initiative. And they were both very kind to humor me when I called them up and asked them really laughably broad questions like, what is the state of migratory bird conservation today? And are you hopeful for the future? And they really both had strikingly similar things to say. They agreed that despite all the ever more detailed migration research happening now, the time for data collection is not over. We still need more data to understand what's behind the declines of many of these species. They agreed that there is a need to consolidate that data that is being collected and get it into the hands of policymakers and conservation activists to work across international borders, to incorporate more partners in the social sciences and more perspectives from Indigenous people. And they both insisted that, yes, there is still reason for hope. So I'm going to close with a little bit of what Pete Mara said to me when I asked him if he feels hopeful about the future. He said, "I'm very optimistic. We've done this in the past. We've corrected other environmental issues, and now we have to deal with climate change. So while it seems like there's this overwhelming deluge of negative issues and challenges with getting people on board with these things and constant pressures on nature, I choose to be optimistic and hopeful just because I don't see any benefit of being pessimistic or having a lack of hope. I just don't choose to take that route. Don't get me wrong, there are times when I might be negative or spiraling down into a pit of agony, but I'm not going to do that." I thought those were wise words, and I don't know about all of you, but when I find myself spiraling down into a pit of agony, I usually just go birding. So that is the conclusion of my talk. I don't know if maybe Elaine could put this URL in the chat again where it's clickable. If you are interested, you can go to my website here, RebeccaHeisman.com. If anyone, I obviously can't sign books in person because this is over Zoom, but if anyone feels moved to go out and buy a copy after seeing this talk, you can email me through the contact form on my website, and I would love to send you a signed bookplate to stick in it to transform it into a signed copy. I also, if you're interested in this sort of thing, I do a lot of freelance writing about cool bird science. And I have an email. The other thing you can find on my website, you can see the sign up for my email newsletter. I send it out just once every couple months, and it's what I've been writing about and popular science book recommendations and things like that. So I do some social media, but social media is so weird these days. I would say that the email list is the best thing to keep up with me. And with that, I would love to take some questions.
Yay! You can't get the smiling face out here. Thank you very much. I think we have a couple of questions. If I may, I'll read them. You might have already gotten there. Dave Kraft asks, what might be the next generation technology out there that will be used to track migration?
I get that question a lot. To the best of my knowledge, there's no like new, totally different thing coming that would be like a whole separate chapter in my book that's not there currently. But I think with the tracking devices like satellite and GPS transmitters, those are getting smaller and smaller and smaller all the time, meaning you can put them on smaller birds. And they are adding more and more different types of data that they collect. Now they have ones that have like sensors for barometric pressure and stuff, so you can find out what sort of weather the birds were flying through. So I think those miniaturized high-tech tracking devices are going to be where it's at in the next decade.
Right. Some of you may be familiar with MOTUS, M-O-T-U-S, a burgeoning from Birds Canada originally program with towers all over places, and it's really promising to, as you know, and put in your book, not only birds, but butterflies, dragonflies, and other small items that you wouldn't think could.
Yeah, MOTUS is very cool. And yeah, that's the second half of the radio chapter in my book is MOTUS.
I've just turned off that share for a bit so we can all enjoy looking at our names. In fact, if anyone wishes to unmute and ask a question, feel free.
Oh, please do.
That birdcast phenomena, or I guess instrument, is just so amazing, and I bet at least half of you have tried it. The web link is there again in the chat. I took a look, and Kathy Sledeback, I know you're watching these all the time, but today is Monday night and Sunday night, but on Saturday night there were 2,793,500 birds that crossed Washington State, according to Birdcast. Just extraordinary, the fine resolution that they're able to get now.
I don't know that they are literally counting individual birds on radar. I think there's some estimating that goes into that, where they're, calibrating with other data sources.
Yes. A question, Rebecca, do you have a next project that you're working on?
Sorry, I just saw in the chat that Bruce Taves is here. Hi, Bruce. He's in the book. Do I have a next project that I'm working on? I really hope to write a second popular science book. I don't want to get too much into what that might be about, because at this point I don't know whether it's going to happen. It will depend on whether this book sells well enough for my publisher to think that I'm a good bet. But like I said, I do a lot of other freelancing too. I write for Audubon and places like that, so I've always got something cooking.
And a child that I believe just went into kindergarten or something.
Yes, my son literally just started kindergarten in the past month, so that's been exciting.
Well, it's so nice that we've gotten to know you a bit. Again, if there's any other questions anyone has, please feel free to just pipe up. You can say it faster than you can type it, probably.
Someone asked about MOTUS. It's M-O-T-U-S, no E on the end. And what that is, if you're not familiar with it, is it's a network of radio receiver towers that can automatically pick up the signals of birds with transmitters that fly by, so that you don't have to follow the birds in a station wagon.
Oh, that reminds me. Do you happen to remember was the picture of Lowry labeled, was he holding an ivory-billed woodpecker? 'Cause he was from
Yes.
Louisiana.
Yes, I occasionally I get a question about that. I was like, yes, good spot. Yes, Lowry was holding a taxidermied ivory-billed woodpecker in that photo, and I believe that has to do with the fact that the other thing that he's known for besides moon watching is championing some very questionable ivory-billed woodpecker sightings in the 70s or 60s. So
That's wonderful, wonderful. I'm glad that you used that photo. Well, on this note, thank you, Walla Walla, for being home to a wonderful influence on the birding world. We're very grateful that you were able to find time in your busy schedule to speak to us tonight. I'll remind our audience that next month we're also having an online only meeting, and we believe we're going to have a talk on the prairie habitat of the Palouse, that wonderful grassland area. Again, we thank you very much, Rebecca, and everyone else for coming along. And on that note, good night.
thank you for having me.